Okay, hello. Yes, today, as with regards to the voting, we will talk about the strategy workbench in Simulator Controller. It's one of the tools which you can use outside from your racing simulation to prepare a race or just to try different strategy approaches and so on. I think you have all seen this window already. This is the main window of the strategy workbench, which appears when you start the app. And
You are not sharing the screen
oh,
yet.
oh, yeah. Thank you. Not sharing the screen. Here is the screen. Okay. But the OBS is already recording, so there everything is fine. Okay. Let's start with a walk around through this window before we dive into the different features the strategy workbench has to offer. The window is divided in two main sections or two main areas. The upper one, it's called Telemetry and is used to give you a kind of reporting and querying tool to take a look at all the data which has been recorded by your assistants during your past sessions. To enable the recording of the data, you have to go to the Race Strategies tab in the configuration or in the simulator setup tool and enable save telemetry at session end. And you have three different options. No action, which means nothing will be saved. No good idea. Always save, which is the option I use, and you have also the option that the race strategist will ask you at the end of the session whether you have been fine with the recorded session and that the telemetry data should be saved. But I recommend to always save because it does no harm. The approach using the data for the strategy workbench is a kind of big data approach with lots of mathematical calculations with standard deviation algorithms and stuff like that. So some bad data will really help in terms of data quality. We will see that a little bit later. But keep in mind, enable this for all the simulators you will use the strategy workbench for. And yes, we have seen this in a different session already. So what do you have here? In this area, you can select the simulator you want to work with, the car and the track, and the different weather conditions, which will have an impact on the set of available data you will see here. For example, in dry conditions, I have 200 laps in Monza recorded for the McLaren with map 1 and 5 with map 2. In drizzle conditions, I have 9 laps with dry tires and 5 laps with wet tires, and it becomes more wet. There are only wet tires, but also different engine maps and so on. If you have selected your conditions, you can choose the compound, which in pure dry will always be dry, but here, for example, in drizzle, you have the choice between the dry and wet tire set for the data which will be shown here. And then you can choose the x-axis from the set of data, for example, the fuel consumption we will have here and the lap time. You can add other data sets as well here. for example, the temperatures, and you can choose between different chart types and so on. So here you have some sort of query tool to take a look at the data, but you can't do anything on your own with this data, just looking at it. In the lower area of the strategy workbench, you will find, I call it a premium fuel calculator, which allows you to create a strategy, a pit stop strategy for every possible kind of race which is possible with the given simulators. And let's start with a very simple example. For example, we want a 60-minute race in Monza with a required pit stop in the typical half-hour range. Refueling is required, but tire change will be optional. We will have a formation lap and we will have a post-race in-lap. Then you go here and define the type of services during a pit stop and which time they will require, and also the so-called pit lane delta, the time required for doing a drive-through in comparison to a drive-by. These data is used to calculate the amount of time needed for one pit stop. It would be very unpleasant to always type in this data each and every time you change car and track. So therefore, there are several ways to initialize all these data here, all these fields. You have the option to initialize it from a loaded strategy. We will see that a little bit later. You can initialize the fields from the race settings. You have seen the race settings application, which allows you to enter information for an upcoming session. And there you will also find this data, so we can import it from here. And the most effective and efficient way to initialize these settings is from the session database, initialize from the database, which means that you have here in the session database a possibility to define a lot of values which are in use by the race assistants, or also here by the strategy workbench and by other tools from the simulator controller suite, so that you have to enter it only once. For example, here for the simulator Assetto Corsa Competizione, I have a lot of default values. For example, I want always to use a safety fuel of 5 liters in all calculations. I will always have a formation lap in my sessions, and so on and so on. And which is interesting and helpful, for example, here for the pit lane delta, when you select the track, for example, Monza, you can enter the pit lane delta once, and it might be used here by initialize from database. It will load all the values which you have entered here in this tool. As always, if there are any questions, please jump in and feel free. After you've entered the pit stop and service values, you can go to the simulation tab and prepare the simulation of the strategy. First, you have to decide on which compound you want to start into your race. Which fuel amount will be your the level of amount of fuel you will use at the starting line, and so on. Once you've entered all this, you can specify here if you only want to use the values you entered here, if you only want to use data which are available from the telemetry, or if you want to use both. Let's first talk about this one. For example, if we have a car and a track we have never driven on, it would be impossible to derive a strategy because the Workbench does not know the amount of fuel you have per lap, your average lap time, and so on. But I decided that even in this case, because I call it a premium fuel calculator, it must be possible to create a very simple strategy. And this is the so-called initial conditions. If you have no telemetry data, you can simply type in the average lap time and the consumption you assume for the session, and you can simulate a strategy with this data. Once you have a lot of data here, I recommend only to use telemetry data. If you have only a few laps recorded, it might be helpful or it might be of benefit to use a kind of hybrid approach. Okay. Now,
I have one question, sorry, about the fuel amount.
Yes.
Because I think the starting fuel amount is quite important.
Yes.
So if I enter a fuel amount here, will that always be used, or will I have other suggestions?
We will come to that.
Okay.
It has a lot to do with this pedal here, which is, yeah, we will talk about that a little bit later. Okay. Let's first run a very simple strategy. Okay, I press the simulate button. There will be a progress bar you can't see because it opens on my main screen. I have a triple screen setup, and this is the main screen, so you can't see the progress bar, which is no problem for this very simple strategy because it only takes a few seconds to calculate this. The strategy Workbench has derived a strategy with one pit stop, which yes, for sure, it is required here. No tire change. Okay, we can run with this 1 hour race with no tire change, and we entered here optional. And yes, we have some refueling going on because we started with 90 liters. And the output, the strategy calculated, I hold the control key while pressing on the simulate button so that the report will load it without any further interaction. But you can also call this menu command use a strategy once you have here in the preview or summary area a strategy which is fine for you. Otherwise, the currently selected strategy will not be overwritten. So we have here a two-stint strategy with a pit stop at lap 16, or at lap 17 to be precise, at the end of lap 16. We have some refueling, and we will use the tire until the end of the race. Okay. Let's try a different thing. We will have a required tire change, and not surprisingly, we will now have also a tire change.
Just one question about the tire change. The tire usage 40 laps, is that the maximum amount of laps you want to run with the tire?
Yes, it's a kind of default. It's the same. The answer is the same as for your question with the fuel amount. It's a default value we start with, and as long as you don't use the optimizer, yes, the simulation will try to change the tires at least after 40 laps, or earlier according to the pit stop rules. But you can work, we will see this, with the optimizer, and he will try to get the best possible out of your tires.
Okay.
Okay. So let's try a different one. This was a very simple strategy. Now we want to go to the McLaren. We already have it. We will go to Mount Panorama and run a 24-hour race with a 65-minute stint limit, which is quite typical. No required pit strategy. Reinitialize the data here and simply let's run a simulation. It will take a little bit longer, still working, and there is the results. So here is your stint plan, and yes, the graphical description of your race. As you can see, the strategy simulation will already try to optimize your last stints to make them more or less even in terms of fuel load. The simulation will not do this for the earlier stints, because I think you already have run some endurance races. There are always some incidents or weather changes, so the strategy will never be implemented in the way it is calculated here, because of surprises and stuff like that. So, but the last stints may be optimized. If you want the simulation to level the amount of fuel, you can do this. We will come to that. Okay. Yes, let's start with the fuel optimization. We have here a starting fuel amount of 90 liters, which might be beneficial according to my own experience. I almost always use, if it's possible, without introducing another additional pit stop, I will always try to use less fuel in the first stint, because it helps in the position fights at the beginning of the race. But maybe we will try here a different approach. We will try to, let's say, we will tell the optimizer that he can play with the fuel amount and try to resimulate the race. Maybe he will come up with a different strategy here. This will take quite a long time, because now he is going to create a lot of different scenarios with some kind of permutative algorithm. Now it's ready, and as you can see here, he will start with more fuel, not the max amount which is possible in Mount Panorama, which is 125 liters for the McLaren, but more than 90, yes, right. And he will come up with less fuel for the later stints, but it's still not enough to, let's say, save a stint at the end. So maybe we will try this strategy or go back to the earlier one. Let's talk about data before we go to the other features here. As I said at the beginning, the strategy Workbench uses a kind of big data approach. So the more data you have here for different maps, for different conditions, even for different level of fuels and different amount of used tire laps, the more precise the calculations here will become, or will get. There are some algorithms implemented in the strategy workbench. For example, a very complex tire model with tire performance degradation curves. I think they are of fourth order. So he knows that the tire degradation in the first few laps is quite steep. Then you have a plane level, for example, for the next 20 to 25 laps, and then the tire begins to degrade, and at the end the degradation is quite steep before you will get a complete failure of the tire. This is built in, but to precisely calculate that, you will have to have a lot of data here. For example, the lap time with regards to the number of used tire laps, and you see, okay, here is some sort of increasing lap times. The slope is positive of if you will draw a straight line here, but even this amount of data is maybe not enough to really precisely calculate what the tire will do in the 40th lap, for example. There's also an algorithm for fuel level dependent lap times or car weight dependent lap times, but the same applies here as well. You will have to have a lot of data in there that these calculations will be precise. And to be honest, in an endurance race, shit happens. So I don't think that this will be of very much benefit, that you will have a precise strategy calculation up to the second digit after the point. Your race will be different for sure.
One question.
Yeah.
I'm trying to get the same data on screen, and I don't see tire laps in my x-axis choices.
You have to choose tires.
Yeah.
You have two different set of data. One is for electronics and lap times, and the other is for tires and lap times.
Clear. Yeah.
Okay. So we already used the optimizer here to play with the initial fuel, and you have seen that in this example the starting fuel has been increased, and which leads to some kind of less fuel level in the later stints, which overall will be of benefit with regards to the lap times and therefore the race result, as long as the strategy simulation shows here. Let's try a different thing. We will use a shorter race for this example. Let's take a 4-hour race. I will run the simulation. Okay. Okay. So here we have an example where it might be possible to skip an additional tire change. Let's try this. We will instruct the optimizer to play with different tire laps. So running extending the tire life, which might be possible according to the data on tracks which are not so hard to the tires. Still optimizing. Here's the result. And yes, in this case, he overruns the tire in the first 2 stints and saves 1 tire change. Not of great benefit here because refueling still takes the time, so nobody will use this strategy, but it is possible in this case. Okay. Before we dig deeper into the optimizer and other options like scenario validation, let's talk about what you can do with the strategy you derived here. Yes, you can print it, right mouse button and print it and send it to your friends or whatever. But the most interesting option is to set it as the race strategy, which means that this strategy is saved in a special location. It's the config folder in your local simulator controller folder in your user directory. And when you go to, when you enter a session, and this session is with the given car on the given track, and the session duration, the session length, is the same as we have used while creating this strategy. The race strategist, the virtual assistant, will load the strategy and will use it for your session. And it will handle the strategy on its own. So it will inform you that the pit stop is coming up, that he will ask you if the race engineer should be informed, and everything which has been calculated here, for example, the amount of fuel needed, whether you want to change tire or not, will be passed to the race engineer, and the pit stop settings will be derived accordingly. So you can use the strategy you calculated here in a physical race with the help of the race assistants. You can also store them away on your hard drive. There is a file format for a given strategy. You can compare different strategies according to their performance and so on, which will create a graphical display of the strategy comparison over here. But as I said, the most important and interesting one is this set as race strategy. Another benefit, another possibility is to use the strategy in conjunction with the race center in a team race. I prepared something here. This is a recording of a race from the last weekend, a 6-hour race on Barcelona. Unfortunately, we had a disconnect in the last stint, so we did not finish the race, but everything was recorded up to this point. And we had this strategy for this 6-hour race. And now let's assume that something happened. For example, there was an incident or a weather change, so you need to adopt your strategy to the changed circumstances. This is possible because the engine which is running beneath the strategy workbench is also built into the race center. So when you have loaded the strategy for the given race into the race center, you can recalculate the strategy according to the current race situation. The current race situation means Okay, we are in lap 150. We have 66 liters amount of fuel remaining. The current weather is dry and so on. But we had a crash and we need to come in and make some repairs. And what we can do here is using this base strategy, which was prepared for the race, we want to recalculate the strategy for the remaining part of the race. What does this mean? Okay, simply use adjust strategy. He will run the recalculation and you will only see the remaining part of the strategy with the starting conditions from the current lap, which means 66 liters. The tires already had some laps on it, around 15 laps has already been run with these tires and so on. If you have a weather change, I don't have an example here, but for example, it has began to rain, he will try to use different tires for the remaining part of the strategy. He will use all the data you have, for example, for wet tires in your database, and will come up with an adjusted strategy with less fuel consumption and so on. And you will also be able to, let's say, use some kind of traffic influences here, which might lead to different laps when to pit, where, for example, an undercut is possible. So you have a very deep integration between the strategy workbench and the race center for team endurance races. And you can also, for example, you can also come up with a complete new strategy. Let's do something stupid. We will use this mount panorama strategy. I will store it away at my desktop as a test strategy. And we will go into the race center and load this strategy into the race at Barcelona. That is because I said that is a stupid one because of this, but it's possible. Okay, so strategy workbench might be very beneficial for an endurance race if something severe happens during the race. Any questions so far?
No.
No. Okay, then I think, buckle up. There are some rapids and some waterfalls ahead. Now it gets interesting. The examples we have seen so far are from Assetto Corsa Competizione, which is a very simple simulation because it only has GT cars and only have one type of tire available and so on. Let's try a different one. Here we have an example for a Formula One car in R-Factor 2. The data I have imported here is interestingly not from R-Factor itself, therefore unknown, no unknown car, unknown track, but it's from a real car. And let's play with this. We have data for two different type of dry tires. With a red compound, it's a soft compound, and white, it's I think a middle soft. Blue will be the hard tires, I think. And yes, let's talk about a 3-hour race. Stint limit does not say anything. And we have restricted tire sets. We will have 2 red ones and 1 white one. Okay, so let's come up with a strategy for this. There is no current scenario. Okay, which means with the settings I entered here, the system is not able to create a valid strategy. Why is this? Because I forgot something. We only have this type of tires, but I set the simulation start with a simple dry tire, which we do not have. Simple dry tire is a dry tire with a black compound. So we need to choose here one of those 2 available compounds. Rerun the simulation. Oh, I forgot to put the slider to the left. So he's trying a lot of different scenarios currently. And yes, it comes up with here this strategy, which looks quite odd. This is why, because we started with a red compound and we do not allow to change the compound. We must explicitly allow the optimizer to change the tire compound during a running session. Okay, let's try this one. Okay, now we have a valid strategy. And at the first pit stop, he changed to the white tire. We have 1 here. At the second pit stop, he uses the remaining second red tire. And then we need another pit stop and we are out of tires. So we are running. Yeah, we will get a problem here because we overrun the tire almost with 100%. So this is not a valid strategy and not a valid scenario. You will never run a 3-hour race with a Formula 1 car with 3 tires. So, okay, we have to do something. We will add another tire. Okay. 3-hour race in Formula 1 will be some kind of endurance race. So nothing realistic here, but now we have a strategy with valid tire changes. Okay, so now we will activate additional rules for scenario validation. Scenario validation means you have in your race a given set of race rules which need to be obeyed so that your race is valid. In current Formula 1, the rule says that you are not allowed to refuel, and if you do not run wet tires, you will have to run at least 2 different types of tire compounds. Okay, we enable this rule set here and run the simulation. And what do you mean, what will happen? There is no current scenario because the race is too long. We need refueling, which is not allowed in Formula 1, so we have to shorten this race. Let's say, what about 90 minutes? I don't know if this is possible. And we will start with 120 liters. I don't know if this is okay. Let's try it. No, still not possible. Still needs refueling, so let's say, just for this example, 160 liters. Still refueling? No, no refueling. Okay, fine. Re-enable this. And yes, this is a valid Formula One strategy. He started with the red tire and he switched to white tire and no refueling. What is happening here? These rules are an extendable set. You can write your own rules for your racing series. We will come to this right now. These rules are used as an extension to the simple pit stop rules you are able to enter here, which are quite okay and for GT races and Assetto Corsa Competizione, for example. But if you have a more complex racing series with more complex rules, you have a small programming language which you can use to apply more complex or complicated rules to the simulation engine. For sure, everything is well documented in the documentation. Here is the documentation for the Sergi Workbench, and there is a section which is named Scenario Validation, which describes this small scripting language and how to use it. There are examples in there, and exactly this one is the example for the Formula One race, which means a scenario is then valid if we have no refuels, refuel 0, and if we have a set of tire sets used during the pit stop which apply this valid tire sets rules, which means I either used in my race a wet tire or I used an intermediate tire, then it's fine, then I can use whatever I want. Or we have only used dry tires and the unique set of compounds used has a length of greater 1, which means I have at least used 2 different set of tire compounds, two different tire compounds. For example, in our example here, red and white. I don't know if any one of you has programming experience. The language which is used here is called Prolog. It's a programming language, as the name says, for programming in logic. It's not a very typical programming language for algorithmic problems, but it's very easy to use for declarative problems, as you've seen here. Yes, everything here is documented, but you have to have some programming background to use this. Okay, but it is really is easy, and I prepared something here, the coaching example. If you hold down the control key while choosing your own examples, you will open an editor, the normal Windows text editor, which you can use to work with the code. You cannot do this for the free built-in rule sets, so they are part of the distribution, cannot be changed, but they are described in the documentation. So now let's come to this simple example we want to use for for our strategy here. A scenario is valid if we have a refueling, so we have a refuel amount which is greater than 0, and if we have used at least one red and at least one white tire compound. Okay, let's try this one. Go back here, decrease starting fuel, tire compound must be changed, and choose this one and run the simulation. And yes, now we have a valid. We started with with red, switch to white, and yes, we have some refueling. Okay. Second example. We won't only want a scenario where no white tires will be used. So we use the none predicate, which means the strategy scenario is valid if we have refueling and we use no white tires and we used at least one red tire. Save it. Rerun the simulation. And now he changes to red tires. Since we have 2, if we decrease that, he can't derive a valid strategy for this one. So I think it's a power user feature, but for race series in R-Factor or Automobilista 2 with more complex pit stop rules, you can implement them here as well. Okay, I will load a prepared strategy. Initialize everything from this strategy, which means all the data here is loaded from this strategy. And now we have 4 red tires, 1 white. Still the coaching example, the coaching rule set. And we will run a simulation. Which means now we have 2 pit stops and we are using only red tires here because this is the current rule set. I know this is quite complicated and maybe I cannot find the right words to tell it to you very precisely. Any questions?
No.
No. Okay. More information about the optimizer. You have seen the tire compound slider, which means when it's 0, the strategy simulation is not allowed to change the compound you've chosen at the start of your session. So if you want to have compound changes at least move it to the first blip, which is 2 here. The more you move it to the right, the higher the probability that during a pit stop, a tire compound is chosen which is not the current one. But you will be limited to the compounds you have entered here. Even if you have more compounds, different compounds available in the data, the system will only use the ones and the available tire sets which you have entered here. The tire usage slider will allow the simulation to overuse the tire. 0 means it will run at maximum 40 laps. This does not mean that the strategy will always use 40 laps of your tires, because a pit stop might be required because of refueling, or because the data shows that the tire degradation will start earlier. But when you allow the overuse of the tire, for example here, it will try to overuse it and thereby saving a pit stop, for example, which might or might not be beneficial to the overall race. Not enough here, let's move it more to the right, which is not a realistic example, but only for didactic purposes. Still running, still running. He's calculating thousands of different scenarios currently. But it has seen for sure that the overuse, according to the data, does not anything good to the overall race performance. So it will not overuse it in this example. The initial fuel slider we already have seen. It will allow the simulation to increase the fuel amount for the first stint. 100 means it might double the amount of fuel for your starting stint, but it will never go above the fuel capacity of the car. Bob, do you have a question?
Do in a moment. Go ahead.
Okay, fine. And last but not least, the consumption slider. This is a very special one. In some endurance races, you will find strategies where the simulation shows that, for example, using a map 2 or map 4 for your car might be beneficial because of the decreased fuel consumption, which might end up using saving one pit stop, thereby compensating for the reduced lap time which you will have with one of the higher maps. And you can also tell the optimizer to go even further, which means that let's go back here, for example, to Assetto Corsa Competizione. McLaren on Barcelona. We know we have with map 1 an average fuel consumption, let's say about 2.75. I unfortunately have no other map data here, but I know I have the Okay, I have it here. Yes, okay. With map 1 on Mount Panorama, we have full consumption on average from 3.6. With map 2, 3.4, and with map 4, let's say 3.35 is the average here. As I said, the strategy simulation might come up with a strategy using a different map, not map 1, which is the most performant one. And you can go even further with this slider because you can tell the simulation engine that you will use or apply driving techniques to reduce the typical average fuel consumption even further. For example, maybe someone of you heard about lift and coast, which means that you don't wait until the last possible braking point before a corner to step on the brakes, but you will lift from the throttle even quite early and coast up to the corner, which might save some fuel in endurance races. And the fuel consumption slider will let you specify the percentage of the average fuel consumption you will try to save with lift and coast techniques. For example, if you know that you can save around 5% of fuel using lift and coast, and you run the strategy simulation, the average fuel consumption will be reduced by this amount. So this for the optimizer area here. I think, yes, we have seen almost everything. Any questions remaining?
Not for me.
Yes, please.
Yes,
You hear me?
Yes, I hear you. Go on.
Oh, okay. I think we all agree that this racing is a catastrophic event, really. And predicting this kind of pea in the wind, right? So, I mean, something that's going to last past the first 25 laps is just kind of pea in the wind. So wouldn't it be obvious to run your Monte Carlo simulation every lap? The new recommendation?
Sort of. You can do it in the race center if you're using the race center in your race and something happens which is far off your given strategy. I don't mean that you have run a lap which is 5 seconds off the pace, which is in the error range, let me say so. But for example, you have an accident and you must go to the pits and have some repairs. As I said before, you can recalculate the strategy based on the base strategy you derived for the race, and the recalculation will incorporate the new situation in the resulting strategy. You can do this in the race center. You cannot do this using the race assistants alone because they do not have enough data to do this. And yes, then you're on your own.
But why don't we just recalculate every lap and leave it up to the driver to accept or deny?
This is what the race assistants do if you're running without a strategy. If you use the virtual race engineer and the virtual race strategist, and if you ask them during your session that you what's their best recommendation for the next pit stop, they will do exactly that. They will look at the fuel level you have remaining. They will look at the tire life you have used so far, and they will recommend the next best pit stop, but only the next one. They do not look any further.
Are they?
Yes?
No, go ahead.
They can't look
Go ahead.
Okay, they can't look any further than up to the next pit stop. And if you
Well, so you win the race to the next step, you put pit stop, but then you screwed yourself for the race, then, right?
yes, that's right. But
Okay.
but it's
You know, we need a video. Hey,
yeah
let me. Okay, I'm going to speak here. The video, this thing actually running with somebody, human running it. Okay, this is grasping me. And this, you're either going to be driving it
yeah
or you're going to be running a simulator. Is that right?
yeah. I'm not sure if I get you right.
Okay, to get me right. It looks to me like there's a one heck of a workload. I don't think even Hamilton could run this thing and drive at the same time. Is that right?
You mean it's a lot of work to prepare a race this way? Did I get you?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. But it's not. But that's is something the real race teams are doing. For example, they are calculating a strategy, then they derive a stint plan from this strategy when they're running a team race, an endurance race. For example, you can derive the stint plan for the race directly from the strategy you have calculated before. And this is the way you go into the race. Yes, and then shit happens and you have to adopt. That's reality. But if you take it seriously, you will have something like a starting strategy for races. Maybe not for a 30-minute race you are running in an open lobby in Assetto Corsa Competizione, but if you take it seriously and running a 24-hour race at Spa, for example, you will have to have something like a plan. And because of that,
Okay.
yeah, and yes, you're
So,
absolutely right. Shit happens then, and you have to adopt.
no, I just made a reference to it being a catastrophic event all the time, you know.
Yeah,
And it just seems, well, anyway, I'd sure like to see a video of this in action during a race. Otherwise, I'm about done, wore out.
I can't
No.
give you a video, but this session you see here in the race center, this one was recorded live during a 6-hour race on last Saturday, and we have used the complete toolset. We prepared the strategy with the strategy workbench. We loaded the strategy into the race center. We created the pit stop plan from that, the stint plan from that. And as you see here, the estimated times out of the strategy and the real times, the actual times from the real race session are quite okay. They are, yes, here it's 10 minutes up. We lost 4 minutes in contrast to the pre-calculated strategy. And that we had a catastrophic failure, a disconnect, and the race was finished.
Well, why don't you show me a video of that? Next time you run a 6-hour race, capture all the video, okay?
I can do this. Yes, I can do it. Okay.
And that'll be a whole lot more interesting than sitting here looking at chart after chart after chart. I want to see what actually happens. Real time.
Real
know,
time.
real time.
Real time is one of the guy is racing and the other guys are staring at this screen and try to prepare the next pit stop for the driver and so on. Yeah, but understood. I will try recording and give you a download link for that.
Thank
Okay.
you a whole bunch. Thank you.
Okay. So 1 hour is up. Any questions remaining? Seems
Not for me.
Okay, then I stop the recording.